I'm going to talk a little bit about what social constructionism in language implies for us as language teachers, whether it's true, whether it's useful, and if it is useful, how we can possibly go about teaching it. Um, so I'm responding to a video by a former colleague of mine who, like me, used to teach in Japan. So the first question is whether social constructionism in language is true, whether words' meanings are co-constructed. Let's see how many buzzwords I can get into this video. Words' meanings are co-constructed, or whether they're somehow inherent to the word itself. I think anybody who takes studying language seriously has to be a social constructionist. I don't know if that's bias on my part or just having reached that conclusion and seeing no way out of it. So if you're not a social constructionist when it comes to language, you must think that when people say the word Wednesday, they're literally invoking the god of Odin, and they might not be aware of this, but they literally are doing that. So when actually there's sort of an offshoot of, I don't know what the opposite of social constructionism in language is, but when people assume that words have meanings that are somehow stuck into the word itself, and if you use it in some other way, then you're using it the wrong way, and some rule of the universe is being violated, which I think of as sort of like first language literalism, to try to give it a name. There's a sort of intuitive version of this, and then there's an ideological version of this, in which people assume that the words in their first language really mean what they think they mean, and words in other languages are just what people call them in those languages. In other words, it's like social constructionism for other languages, but not for your own language. And the intuitive version of this is what I saw most often in Japan, in which the meaning of an English word could only be a Japanese word. An English word didn't mean anything by itself. It could only mean a Japanese word, and a Japanese word just meant what it meant. And that's, to me, that's what I think when I see the word cards that the video that I'm responding to described. And don't get me wrong, that's a good way to get your foot in the door with new vocabulary, but it's not what the vocabulary means. Anyway, so whether social constructionism is true, I think it is true. I think there's the most applicable, the most visible application of the opposite of social constructionism in the language classroom is, I think, what I described, where students assume that words in the second language only mean something in their first language, and the words in the first language just mean what they mean. And I see this a lot with students who come from sort of a monolingual, not just monolingual, but a country with an ideology of monolingualism. And I see it less from students whose first language is different from the language of their education, or they come from a country that has many official languages. Anyway, as for the second point, whether it's useful for learners, whether it's useful for language learners, I think it's useful in some circumstances. It's useful for students to realize that languages and all words are social constructs or mere products of agreement among their speakers. When the opposite of that has become a barrier to their advancement, and I've seen this many times throughout my career, where there's a student whose only approach to learning language is by dedicating all their mental resources to translation, where they get to maybe the TOEIC 500 or so level, to use a barometer that was popular in Japan. So, a sort of low intermediate level of comprehension, not even of production, but just comprehension. And you can see their CPU running very hot while they're doing that. And the reason is they're trying to apply these rules that they learned in school of translation just at faster and faster speeds and with more and more words and more complicated grammar. Um, and they, pretty quickly reach the speed where reach the CPU usage, to continue the same metaphor, where it stops functioning, right? And these students, I would often, maybe not necessarily productively, say, maybe you should read more. Maybe you should use corpora to study instead of just the bilingual dictionary. Corpora, of course, give you collocations and a lot of words in context, and are really, if I'm allowed to say, the best way to learn certain kinds of vocabulary, especially really genre-specific vocabulary. But anyway, um, a student who's at that point would definitely benefit from disassociating um, the meanings in English from the meanings in their first language, and maybe stop thinking about uh, the English word dog as somehow containing the Japanese word inu, and only being able to see the English word that way as somehow intrinsically containing this Japanese word, which just means what it means, um, and see English as sort of playing a role in an ecosystem that's different from Japanese and has its own conventions, has its own words and grammar that are its friends and its usual associates. And I don't know, that's my usual metaphor for explaining social constructionism to language students. Um, and the only reason that it has those roles is because everyone who speaks English agrees that that's what they are, or whatever, dialect they're trying to learn of English. So that's the situation that I think it is useful for students to hear and understand the philosophy behind social constructionism in language. And in other cases, I don't think it's really necessary. I think a lot of people come to that place on their own. And I don't have any real idea as to who ends up needing this kind of intervention and who doesn't. I know I saw it more in Japan than I see now, and I see it more from my students from monolingual backgrounds than from multilingual backgrounds. But of the students who are from monolingual backgrounds, I saw it. I didn't see any particular, red flags that would tell me this student would definitely, demographic red flags that would tell me that this kind of student would probably need a primer in social constructionism. I had a lot of students over last summer who were all from monolingual backgrounds, but had no trouble at all seeing language for all its unique facets and, let's see, understanding that a word in English is not just a translation of a word in their first language. So as for the third question, so the first question was, is social constructionism true? The second is, does it benefit students to learn it? And the third is, can we teach it? That's always an issue when you're a language teacher, because there's no limit to the things that the teacher knows but can't just tell the students and have them understand it. And of course, in applied linguistics, that's like the foundational principle of our entire field. So I don't think the explaining of it would necessarily bring them to a place where they were able to see words from then on in ways that you wanted them to, as the reason that you were explaining social constructionism. And the times where I've been successful in getting a student to stop thinking of English words as glosses of their first language. The way I was able to conquer that, or really they were able to conquer that, is by working with the tried and true methods of applied linguistics, like lots of input, extensive reading. I like to have them work with corpora a lot. And when you work with corpora, corpora, you know, um, to some students' disappointment, usually don't tell you the dictionary definition of the word. They only give you context and lots and lots of collocations and really context-dependent data. Um, and when you add that to your suite of resources that you ask students to use, maybe even in addition to whatever other concerns are the main concerns of your course. For example, if you're teaching a TOEIC course, adding this to, TOEIC questions and academic vocabulary lists and things like that, it can not prevent that kind of thinking, but discourage that kind of thinking. Discourage, what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of social constructionism. Just because the amount of mental resources you would need to translate collocations or to translate, context, sort of discourages you from thinking of them that way. And also, you can see plainly when you look at collocations and in words in context that the words just aren't the same. The word dog and the word inu just don't have the same collocations, don't have the same friends, don't occur in the same, well, that's an exaggeration. They have similar friends and they have similar contexts that they occur in, but not exactly the same. And definitely not the same for, academic vocabulary in English and in their first language. Okay, so that's been my conclusion as to the third question, whether we can teach this view of language. Basically, my answer is no, and if you do teach it, it doesn't end up affecting the things that you hoped it would when you started talking about it. Okay, thanks for listening.